call this meeting of the Northeast Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this meeting has been duly called, and that notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. The board will now adjourn into executive session pursuant to the following sections of the Texas Open Meetings Act. Texas Government Code, Section 551.074, to discuss personnel or to hear complaints against personnel, and the time is 5:30. The board will now reconvene into open session. The time is 5:57. Item 4, matters from executive session. A, personnel including but not limited to administrative appointments pursuant to Government Code Section 551.074. 1, possible action regarding routine personnel including but not limited to administrative appointments. A, Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction. Do I have a motion to approve as discussed in executive session?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Hilliard. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? The motion carries. Item B, Principal of Reagan High School. Do I have a motion to approve as discussed in executive session?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Hilliard. Do I have a second? Thank you, Ms. Villarreal. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Item C, Principal of Ed White Middle School. Do I have a motion to approve as discussed in executive session?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Item 5, new business for possible board action. A, Business Services. 1, possible action regarding notice of public meeting to discuss budget and proposed tax rate. Mr. Villarreal.
Yes, Madam President, members of the board, Dr. Mike, executive staff, and guests. This is our yearly notice that we want to publish, so we're asking for approval for June 23rd so that we can have that as our public meeting date.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve publication of the notice of public meeting to discuss budget and proposed tax rates in accordance with Texas Education Code, Section 44.004, setting the public meeting date as June 23rd, 2022?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Hilliard. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? The motion carries. Item 6, presentation. A, budget study session number 1. Mr. Villarreal.
Yes, Madam President, I call Susie Lockhorn, our Executive Director of Finance and Accounting, to talk on this subject. But tonight is our first budget study session. It's going to be kind of at a high level. After we go through the agendas for the budget meetings and the laws and commissioners' rules over budget adoption, we'll move on to discuss our main source of revenue, which is property taxes. We will give a brief update to this year's general fund revenue. Then we will see how our revenue stacks up against the other districts, and then we will discuss school nutrition fund. The budget study schedule, as you can see, today's like our first one, and we're going to talk about revenue basics, school nutrition, and benchmarking. In 2 weeks, we're going to be discussing staffing levels and possible compensation changes. But as you know, 87% of our budget is salaries, so that's pretty much what we're going to be covering. And we'll work to finalize the budget over the 2 weeks that follow and bring you a substantially completed budget on June 20th, with adoption hopefully on June 23rd. The budget adoption rules, no rule changes have come through, so we must adopt a budget by June 30th. The funds that you all will be approving hopefully will be the general fund, the debt service fund, and school nutrition service funds. Adoption must include a public meeting, and we must publish an ad in local newspaper at least 10 days before the meeting. The tax rate doesn't get adopted until August or September. And with that, I'll turn it over to Susie Lockhorn to talk about revenues.
Okay, and before you do that, I apologize. We had somebody sign up to speak to this to this agenda item. At this time, the board will receive comment from those individuals who signed up to speak on the agenda item tonight. Speakers will be called up to speak in the order in which they appear. We want to hear from everyone who signed up. As you know, board members do not respond to public comment during the meeting, although members may request further information or a future agenda item on a matter raised during public comment. As explained fully in the board's written procedures, the matters from the floor, Sorry, this was for a different thing. So we'll now have you come speak. Sorry. It's not the right.
Number 1.
Good evening, trustees. My name is Scott Willis, and I'm a teacher at Roosevelt High School. Excuse me. Anyway, as to the budget, couple things. Number 1, you adopt a budget by June 30th, yet I have to sign a contract and can't get out of it after June 26th. I take thought it perhaps you need to get the budget going first rather than force me into a contract where you could literally cut my pay. I mean, it is cut every year, as you well know, that I lose. This is the first year I've made the same amount of money I did the first year I worked 6 years ago, but that's for next time to go around. How about let's get in a budget and figure out what we're all going to make before you make us sign a contract? I think that's something that the board really needs to take a look at. It might not be for this year because of the dates and how long it takes to get the publish out, but it is certainly something to consider in the future that teachers sure would like to know what you're willing to pay them before they sign a contract. Thank you.
Susie?
Good evening, Madam President, member of the board, Dr. Micah, executive staff and guests. I'm just running through that again out of
That's okay,
habit.
sorry.
Sorry. Been doing this too many years. Tonight we're going to start with a brief overview of revenue. So we talked a little bit back in March about revenue, but I want to go over some of the high-level stuff before we get down to the exciting world of property values. Just a refresh, most of our revenue for the general fund comes from property taxes. Over 3/4 of our revenue comes from property taxes. Then nearly another 15% comes from the state and their foundation school program, and that's what we call state aid. Another 5.5% is something a little strange. It's called TRS on behalf payments, and that's our teacher retirement system. And so how this works is to contribute to TRS, each employee will have money deducted from their check, and so each employee contributes to TRS. And then the district makes contributions to TRS for the employees. And so each month, the district takes the employees' contributions from their checks and the contribution that the district makes and sends them to the teacher retirement system. Now, the state is supposed to contribute too, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for the state to send us money and then us turn around and send them money back, because TRS is part of the state. So what they do is they have us book on our financials their contribution, even though they don't actually send us the money. So we book their contribution as revenue, but we also book the expense of their contribution as expense. And so those two things wash each other out. It's got a matching revenue and matching expense. And so it really has no impact to our bottom line, but it is something that stands out on our revenue. So when you see that 5.5%, it's not necessarily anything that we've received in cash. We're just booking the state's share of contributions to the teacher retirement system for the employees. All right. Now that you've got a long explanation for that, let's look at the other 3%. So we've got 3%, two small amounts for local and federal. And so local will make up a variety of things, such as investment income, or rentals from facilities, or the ticket sales from athletic events. And then federal will be things like the general fund charging federal grants for administration costs. So all those grants enjoy services from the general fund that pays for it, like payroll, accounts payable, HR. So the general fund's allowed to bill federal grants for those services. So high level, that's our makeup of our general fund revenue. Now let's talk about state funding and how that plays a role in our revenue. So the state calculates how much revenue the district should get. They do this primarily using a formula based upon average daily attendance. So that is how many days each kid comes to school. Each student is allocated $6,160. That's called the basic allotment. And that 6160 is there if they come every day. So for every day absent, it's a little less and a little less. So first they calculate that basic allotment. Then they give us additional funds based off of students who need additional support services. So students who are economically disadvantaged, or they're in special instructional settings such as special ed, career and tech, dyslexia, or bilingual, and a few others. These are just examples. Then we'll get additional revenue for those students because the state recognizes that they need additional services. Once they get those two pieces done, there's a handful of small little other pieces that we won't spend a lot of time talking about, but together they combine for Tier 1. And they calculate, I like to call it our Tier 1 entitlement. And then they calculate Tier 2. But Tier 2 is a much smaller piece of our revenue, and so it is intended to enrich districts for any pennies above the base tax rate, and basically they're providing matching funds to the district for those pennies above the base tax rate. Now we're at 5 pennies. They match up to the first 8 pennies above the tax rate. So, but bear in mind, the bulk of our funding comes out of this Tier 1 entitlement. So what are the pieces of that Tier 1 entitlement? Well, we just talked about it, right? Average daily attendance, which is a component of, which is from enrollment and our attendance rate. Then we have those demographics and those instructional settings driving those special allotments for special ed or bilingual. And then down here in the corner, you'll see property value. And it plays a very important role when we're dealing with Tier 1 revenue. So now I have this kind of cheesy little slide here to help you understand Tier 1 entitlement. So think of this cylinder like a cup. And the cup represents our total Tier 1 entitlement that the state formulas calculated for us. Once we have the calculation, the state fills the cup first with property taxes. And anything that's left over, then the state makes up the difference with their contribution. So, a couple of really important things to remember. The state, through its formulas, determines the size of the cup. So, the 6160 per student and all the weights for those students in those special settings, like special ed, those are all in code. So the only way for those to change is if the legislature takes action and passes a law to change them. So the state's creating the size of the cup through those formulas. Then the other thing to remember is that property taxes always fills the cup first, and only then does the state come in to finish it out. Now, every district is different. You saw earlier on that earlier slide, we were about 75% of our total revenue is from property taxes. But a lot of districts, it's a much smaller percentage, and the state is having to fund a lot more. So there are a wide variety of combinations throughout the state. So just bear in mind that no two districts are alike.
So, so the only way to change that is by getting more students or increasing our average daily attendance. So that's the only way you can get more from the state. So if you look at, the cap is 6160. So the only way we can grow revenues is by increasing our enrollment or getting better with our average daily attendance.
All right, so here's Tier 2. And again, this is the enrichment tier. That first 8 pennies above the base rate, the state enriches those pennies. And what they're doing is trying to give districts the same yield of those pennies as a district that was in the 96th percentile of property wealth throughout the state. And so, again, Tier 2, not as a big of a piece as our total revenue as Tier 1. Tier 1's the big one. All right, so let's start looking at property values. In late April, we received preliminary property values from Bear Appraisal District. Bear in mind, these numbers are very preliminary. So late April is even before the property protest deadline, which is May 16th. So we received these values even before the appraisal district had received all the protests for people who felt that their values were not accurate. So we're dealing with very preliminary numbers is what I'm trying to convey here. So we know that what we're showing you, the estimates we're showing you today will likely change, but we did our best to project what we think those numbers will come in at. But bear in mind, this is sort of a unique year. On this slide, I've included a few quotes from when Bear Appraisal sent us the preliminary values, and this is not something we normally see. So residential market shattered records this year. I'm sure most of you have felt it. My own personal property values went up by 37%, and so that had not ever happened to me before. Commercial values had near record increases. So they didn't break the record, they didn't shatter the record, but they got close. And then also Bear Appraisal warned us all that they are expecting a higher number of protests this year. So that means we won't know what our numbers are going to look like until they're done processing those protests. So the more protests they have, the longer it takes for them to get through them and give us final numbers.
And as a reminder, Bear Appraisal District sets the values. We don't just, I know we say that quite a bit, but I guess it's worth repeating that they're the ones who set the values, not the district.
Quick question. On the values, there was no advancement made at all in getting commercial properties to be reporting their sales so that we can get some accurate numbers there?
Nothing yet.
Okay.
So hopefully by July 25th, they're supposed to certify the rolls.
Mm-hmm.
By then, hopefully we'll be able to get some more information, but I know that's been a big issue,
Mm-hmm.
and they still haven't really corrected that, so.
Yeah, I knew that there had been legislation in the past. I knew it didn't go anywhere, and I didn't think the last session saw anything
No, ma'am.
because we take such a big hit there from undervalued commercial. I didn't,
Right.
that could make such a,
And they did hit commercial, just like they did all residential, but, you know, they have a little bit better outs as far as trying to protest their values, so.
Okay.
And then they kind of drag it along. That's why sometimes we get these catch-ups that they, like in 2 or 3 years, they'll try to settle up with us. So that's usually because they kind of drag it through.
right, okay, all right, thank you.
I'm sorry, also kind of to follow up on that, because I think there might be a misnomer out there, but school districts do not give tax abatements like the city does, correct?
Yes, ma'am. Right. I mean, we don't have any abatements. We have no tax incentive districts or anything like that.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so as Dan was mentioning, we will get certified values in late July. So when the state is calculating how much of that cup fills with property taxes and how much they do as their contribution, they're going to use July certified values to do that. And so unfortunately, that means we're adopting a budget before we have those values, but we will be, again, because the total stays the same, we'll still have an idea of what our revenue is going to be. So for now, what we've done is taken a 5-year average of how preliminary values and certified values, how they change. And so, but because we're having a year of higher protests and we don't know how that's going to go, we added an adjustment to account for those higher protests. Is that adjustment too high or too low? We'll have to wait and see. So the numbers we're going to show you in a few slides reflect us trying to accommodate this higher level of protests. All right, but Bear Appraisal will start sending us regular updates in mid-June, so we'll start getting a feel for how their protests are going and, you know, how much is getting approved or, you know, how much in value are they lowering because of the protests. All right, so just for informational purposes, to certify values, the chief appraiser must have the appraisal review board approve at least 95% of the total value. So that means that they can't have more than 5% of protests pending, and, or they do 90% with the chief appraiser certifying an estimate. And in the past, Bear Appraisal hasn't ever had any problems meeting the 95%. So we'll just have to wait and see how this year with higher number of protests will impact that. And then we talked about it in March, but Proposition 2 did pass. So homeowners will now see their homestead exemption move from $25,000 to $40,000. So it will save the taxpayers some money, but ultimately it won't have any significant impact to our overall revenue. All right, so when we looked at these preliminary values, family housing rose 24%. Less than 1% of this was from new construction. The 23.2% was increases to existing homes. And in commercial property, they also saw a significant increase, 16.8%, and 1.9% of that was from new construction. Commercial property owners tend to hire firms to help them with their protests, so we often see a pretty big drop from their values in the preliminary to certified, and it typically drops between 2.5% to 4.5%. But this year, again, kind of record-setting values and increases, so we'll have to wait and see how that goes. All right. And again, we'll get updates starting in June. So this is what we're estimating at the current moment. So appraised value for 22-23, we'll see an increase of $8.5 billion, nearly 16%. Now, the next line on the slide, our homestead cap and exemptions skyrocketed 71.8%. Well, one of those reasons is because the homestead exemption was increased from $25,000 to $40,000. So that's a big piece of it. The other piece of it is the homestead cap. So when a home increases by more, the taxable value increases by more than 10%, or the market value, sorry, the market value increases by more than 10%, the taxable value is capped at 10%. So it cannot have more than 10% growth. So if your market value goes up 15, 16, 24%, then you're only going to pay taxes on a taxable value growth of 10%. And the difference is the cap. And so that's why, because we've seen so much more growth in the area beyond 10%, is why that homestead cap has grown. So overall, that puts the taxable value growing at 8%. Once you back off frozen values and look at our M&O tax rate, that will lead us with this estimate of lowering the M&O tax rate from 95.25 to 91.33. And then frozen properties, we'll still collect those taxes, but it's fixed. And that will lead to an overall increase in M&O taxes of $9.9 million. Now, bear in mind, in the 2019 legislative session, HB 3, House Bill 3, included provisions that prevent school districts from collecting more than 2.5% in taxes. So when property value grows, we have to lower the M&O tax rate. That's why it's going from 95.25 to 91.33. So that is to offset that growth and keep us capped at below 2.5%.
But as a reminder also is once it goes up, property value goes up. So a lot of sometimes taxpayers go, wait a minute, but my property value went up 30% or whatever. We don't get the difference. All it does is that cup analogy. All it is more of that fluid is local tax. It's not like it's increasing our overall revenue. So that means that we're just going to start getting less from the state. And that's what's been happening the last 5 years.
And TEA is going to receive our certified values in July, and eventually they are actually going to tell us exactly what tax rate to use. And so they have a calculation to make sure that we're staying within that 2.5%. So like Dan was just saying, what happens with that 9.9 million more that we get? Well, that increase in that tax levy of nearly $10 million does not increase our overall revenue. So because of that cup, the state is going to give us less. So 10 million more in property taxes means 10 million less in state funding. So again, the cup is driven by the funding formula, and it just gets balanced between the two. So the 10 million is just going to shift from the state to the local property value taxpayers, and we still get the same amount of funding. It stays flat unless attendance or enrollment changes. So that is the overall view of what our preliminary values look like. But here's just a little bit of information about the makeup of the values in the district. So approximately 62% using these projections of the district are in single-family homes, 22% in commercial property, and 10% in multifamily. And so these percentages don't change a whole lot from year to year. They've been fairly consistent. But the one number that really kind of surprised me was the average home market value in Northeast now. Now, bear in mind, this is before those protest adjustments, so it can change depending on how much Bear Appraisal District awards these protests, but it increased to over $331,000. So now you're looking at an average home price in Northeast being over $330,000. I remember when I started with the district a long time ago, that number started with a 1. And so it really feels like very quickly we have moved to a 3. And $330,000 for a young family starting out is, I would say that's probably pretty hard to do. And so housing in Northeast is much more expensive this year compared to last. Now this chart has some interesting trends going on in it. We haven't included numbers for what we're thinking next year will be, and we'll wait until we get certified values to do that. But our orange, reddish color looking line is market value, and then the blue is taxable value, and our green is the levy, how much tax we collect. And so a lot of interesting things here. You can see the market value and the taxable value used to stay in sync pretty well, but then slowly over the years, we started spreading apart. And that spread is happening because more property is becoming frozen and more exemptions are being given. So those are increasing the gap between our market value and our taxable value. And I'll show you some more detail on that in a minute. And then with the levy, you can see this dip back in 07, 08. That's the first time the state did tax compression, where they forced school districts to lower the tax rate from $1.50 to $1.04. And so during that time frame, after that, you can see the levy and the taxable value stayed right together for quite some time. And then around 15, 16, it gets a little bit bigger because that was when the state increased the homestead exemption from $15,000 to $25,000. And then now you can see it the gaps getting bigger and bigger. Well, in 2019, that's when they instituted that 2.5% cap. And so now we have more tax compression. So you see that dip there. And each year, it's not growing at the same rate as the taxable value because of that compression. And so we'll keep seeing that happen each year with this new compression on the tax rate. All right, so let's take a look at homesteads throughout the districts. We were just talking about frozen property. So once a homeowner reaches 65, their school taxes are frozen. That means even though their appraised value goes up, they're going to pay the same amount in taxes. The only exception to this is if they were to make an addition or put in something that increases to improve the property, and then it gets reassessed and frozen again. But we are a district of increasing frozen values. So from 2005 to 2022, homesteads frozen homesteads have increased by 66%. But as you can see, our total homesteads have only increased by 8%. It's not a big growth at all compared to the frozen values. And in 2009, the legislature made another exemption for homesteads owned by 100% disabled veterans. They're 100% tax exempt. So we've also seen growth in that group of homesteads. And ultimately, that little orange piece is worth $1.3 billion of homes in 2022. All right, so let's go back to March. We were here talking about an update, and since then, we've gotten some really good news about TEA is going to provide us with some funding relief. So we talked a lot then about our attendance rate, and then tonight we've said many times how important the attendance rate is to our funding, right? So this year we've seen a decrease in our attendance rate beyond our historical norms. We showed it in March, and we'll do it again here in a minute. TEA, because it's such a major component and because it's a statewide issue, they're going to provide an adjustment. So it's just for 21-22. But what they're going to do is let us use the attendance rate from before the pandemic of 2019-2020 for the first through fourth 6 weeks. And instead of using the attendance rate that we currently have for the first through fourth 6 weeks, we get to use 1920s. And so that attendance rate's higher than what we've been seeing this year, and we'll be able to collect additional revenue for it. And ultimately, it'll probably net us about $7 million in revenue. So yay for that. It's a nice relief, but bear in mind, next year, there's no guarantee that they'll do anything. So it's very important that we're paying attention to our attendance rate. So this is a chart that we showed in March. And as you can see, the blue lines is the current year. And you can see the rate is much lower than what our trend has been. And that fourth 6 weeks, that's the big dip from Omicron. So those first 4 bullets in this year, that rate's going to get replaced with 1920s rate, which is the gray line. So you'll see that'll net us more money. We were hoping that once Omicron settled down and cases came down, that we would see closer to normal attendance rates. Now you can see it's definitely better, but it's not quite at 93%. This for the fifth 6 weeks. The sixth 6 weeks is trending pretty similar to the fifth 6 weeks. So we are not seeing a return yet to those pre-pandemic attendance rates. Now bear in mind, 2021 looks really good, even though that was in the middle of the pandemic, but we had a lot of students attending virtually, so their attendance was great because they were logging in, and so it really helped offset that in-person attendance stuff. So now we have to be very careful monitoring as this is such a big impact to our funding. Now, the other piece that's so critical to our funding is enrollment. And as you can see, we peaked in 13-14 with over 68,000 students, and we've been seeing declines consistently for several years. But once the pandemic hit, we definitely saw an acceleration of our decline. And we were seeing competition from charters consistently as they opened in the district and expanded within the district and nearby. But now we're starting to see a lot more competition from beyond just charters, homeschool co-ops, private schools, virtual schools. So we're definitely seeing a different environment both for average daily attendance and enrollment these days. So definitely big players in our revenue and very important to keep our eye on. So now that we've talked about what our revenue, how it's funded, let's go look at some other districts and their revenue and how we compare. This is 2021's general fund revenue per average daily attendance. And as you can see, we've got a lot of districts to the left of us who have more revenue per ADA than we do. And you can, a couple things go into this. So you can have students in those instructional settings that are driving more revenue. You can have more pennies above the base rate, and so they could be collecting more Tier 2 revenue. When we look at WADA, WADA is weighted average daily attendance. So those instructional settings and those weights are now factored into our average daily attendance. So it's not just straight who's here every day. Now it's who's here and where are they every day. And as you can see, we still have a lot of districts to the left of us with more revenue per WADA. So now let's look at who's collecting more in Tier 2. So as you can see, about half the districts are sitting just like us at 5 cents, and the other half have gone out and gotten more pennies. So these pennies above the compressed rate, the base rate, compressed is just another word for base rate in this scenario. I went ahead and pulled 21-22s instead of 20-21s because there were a couple of districts who actually just went out and got more pennies, and that's Alamo Heights and Comal. So now they're included to the left of us with their additional pennies. And as you can see, like I said, it's about half and half in the area. Another good measure to compare us to is fund balance. So normally when we talk about fund balance here, we're going to talk about it in terms of months of expenditures, how many months of expenditures your fund balance has. Well, all the detail needed to do the calculation I don't have for every district, but I do have the ability to compare their fund balance as a percentage of their total expenditures. So fund balance is the accumulation of all the revenue minus expenditures throughout the year. You can consider it a savings account, but it's not necessarily going to always equate to cash. But it's very important. These are the reserves each district has to help fund them in times of emergency or for when revenue levels are low. So it's important that we have fund balance. As you can imagine, we get most of our cash during property tax payment time. So that's when most of our cash comes in. And during the summer, there are not a lot of property tax payments being made. So we need reserves to be able to get through the summer until we get our next check from TEA or we get another big payment from property taxes. So as you can see, there are a lot of districts and some real outliers here who have a great deal of fund balance. And part of that is they've been able to have more revenue consistently for years, meaning they've been able to save more. So we will definitely be doing more benchmarking each week as we go. So in 2 weeks, when we're looking at health insurance and compensation, you'll see some more comparisons. All right. So now let's talk about school nutrition services. This is always one of my favorite things to discuss. Our school nutrition services program is not included in the general fund. So there are districts where their operations of their school nutrition services department is included in their general fund, but ours is funded by meal reimbursements from the feds and payments from students, and the program is self-sufficient. So we don't need the general fund to contribute to their operations. Okay? So it's a separate fund, and that's why you will adopt it as its own budget. So let's take a look at revenue for school nutrition. With just about everything else, the pandemic had a lot of impact to our school nutrition operations. So the United States Department of Agriculture oversees the school nutrition programs, and in 2021 and 21-22, they allowed us to feed every child for free. And they would reimburse us for each meal we served. Now, normally, before the pandemic, we operated under a program called the National School Lunch Program. And students who qualified would get a free meal, and the USDA would reimburse us for that. Other students would qualify for a reduced price, and the USDA gave us a slightly lower reimbursement rate for those. And then students who didn't qualify for either of those, then they paid. And so now we are going to leave, the Department of Agriculture is no longer going to allow us to continue feeding everyone for free. And now we're going to switch back to the National School Lunch Program, where some students will have to pay, some will be free, and some will have a reduced rate. All right? So you can see that changes where our revenue buckets are going to go from 21-22 to 22-23. So in 22-23, instead of 92% of our revenue coming from federal sources, 77% will come through reimbursements. And we'll now see an increase in our local revenue, which is where those payments from the students and even staff when they pay to eat come from. So overall revenue decline is expected to be $8 million as we switch from program to program. And this is really because we're not getting the federal reimbursement from all those free meals because of they were allowing us to operate what was called the seamless summer option. Summer feeding is what we often call it. And so we were doing summer all year long. But now we're going to go back to what we were doing before the pandemic, the National School Lunch Program. We're going to also have to increase student meals by 10 cents. We'll talk about that more in a minute, and I'll show you that slide and we'll explain it in a minute. We're also going to increase our community eligibility program sites. So the community eligibility program allows us to get funded slightly differently for campuses with higher poverty. And at those campuses, those students, all the students at that campus eat for free. So next year we'll have 38 sites, and we're adding our first high schools. Pretty exciting. So this is the list for next year of all the campuses where the students will eat for free. And the ones with asterisks are the new ones that will be newly added. All right, so let's talk about meal prices. So obviously for 2021 and 21-22, we didn't have any charges for student lunch or breakfast. For 22-23, since we're not allowed to do that summer feeding program anymore, we will have to go back to charging. And when we have to raise rates, it's not something that we necessarily always choose to do. It is a requirement. So the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act requires us to, there's a formula that we have to set our meal prices at equal to the differential between the Fed's reimbursement rates. And so whenever they're changing their reimbursement rates, we will likely have to raise our meal prices because the Feds don't want us to charge such low prices for paid meals that their reimbursements are funding that. And so they require us to increase our meal prices as they are increasing their reimbursements. As always, there's lots of math involved with the Feds. All right, so let's talk about expenditures. So we're looking to grow expenditures by $4 million. As you can see, the bulk of expenditures fall into two categories for school nutrition: salaries and benefits or food and supplies. And we're showing this increase in salaries and benefits, but it's not an increase for the reason you think. Unfortunately, it's because 21-22, we were so short-staffed. So 21-22 is a forecast based off of what we've been doing the current year. 22-23's budget would be if we were fully staffed the entire year. So unfortunately, we've had a hard time finding school nutrition assistants throughout the year, and the incredible office staff over at School Nutrition Services, they have all spent portions of their time filling in, helping out where needed. Every single one of them spent time in the cafeteria this year, just trying to provide relief because we had such a shortage. So that differential is really savings in 21-22 from the fact that we couldn't find enough people to work. A couple other reasons for increasing is that we expect to see some inflation for food costs. We're hoping that, well, obviously the CEP sites where everybody eats free, those sites should see high participation because it's not a change for them. And we're hoping that higher attendance will have higher participation, meaning we need to fix more food. Now, how does the fund look overall? So our forecast for 21-22 looks great, as we have been receiving federal reimbursements for all the meals prepared. 22-23's budget, despite the decline in revenues and the increases in expenditures, still looks good, only to lose $1.2 million. Now, the feds do not allow us to sit at more than 3 months of fund balance for any significant length of time. So they don't want their funds helping you build a savings account. So once you hit 3 months, you eventually have to build a plan to spend the money down. And if that goes on too long and your plan doesn't work, eventually they're just going to skip a reimbursement and give you less revenue that year to fix it. Now, right now, our numbers don't include any compensation increases or any changes to the district's health insurance contribution. So we will bring you new numbers for school nutrition once those things are decided. We'll be talking about them a lot next time. So we'll wait and see how all that factors into their fund balance. And if it's still over 3 months, once those changes come through, then they'll build a plan and work to spend it down. But overall, it's a really nice problem to have. Instead of struggling, there were a lot of districts who had to send money from their general fund over to their school nutrition fund during the pandemic because they weren't able to make ends meet. And so fortunately for us, our size gives us great purchasing power, and leveraging a warehouse really helps too. So we've got a lot of efficiencies that really help us. All right, so let's sum up what we've talked about tonight. Increased property values do not increase our overall M&O revenue. The cup is the cup. And if we get more from property taxes, the state gives us less. And the 2.5% limitation on M&O tax collections, something to keep in mind if your neighbors hear about that cap, they'll say, but my home grew 15%. I thought it was capped at 2.5%. So part of that is it's district-wide. So the growth, the 2.5% cap is not specific to each home, it's district-wide. So you may have, maybe not this year, but you may have homes grow 12% on one side of the district and homes grow 2%, 1% on the other side of the district. And so it's district-wide, that 2.5%, not individual homes. Another thing to consider is that our average daily attendance has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. And every 1% lost in attendance is $4 million in revenue for us. Several area districts have more revenue than we do. And the other thing, that big thing that we talked about is that school nutrition, we will no longer be feeding everyone for free, but we will be increasing our CEP sites, which should help. All right. Now, what questions do you have?
Questions?
I've got just a general question.
Sure.
Tied to the average daily attendance, I think this year was 58,556. And do we have a projection for next year where we're going attendance-wise? We expect it to trend down more, stable, go up a little bit? Are we sure? I know it's a guesstimate.
Well, if I had an 8-ball here, I could shake it. Mr. Hilliard, to be quite frank, our ADA is one of the strongest in the area this year. We have seen districts in the 80s. That's one of those things that we just don't know. As Ms. Crandall showed you, when you look at what we explained to you all in March, is we could kind of understand some of it as COVID kicked in, but it hasn't returned. We see patterns of behavior that are forming, like Mondays and Fridays, our attendance drops. I've heard straight from principals who've shared with me multiple stories of families saying, it's expensive to go to Disney World or Disneyland, whichever one is in Florida, in March, but it's a lot cheaper in April. So we're going to take 5 days and we're going to go. And we're going to log into the Google Classroom and we're going to complete our work. So my child's not going to miss anything. I would disagree with that a little bit. But so we're seeing some things that have not come back and some behaviors that need to be altered, I think, a little bit.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I misspoke. I was talking about the overall enrollment. I said average daily attendance, which is what you answered. Thank you. But the 58,000, do we know what the trend looks like next year? Or is it still too early to guess?
No, we have projections. That is still with a loss, right?
Yes, sir. The 58,556 is for next year.
Okay, that is the one for next
Yes,
session.
yes, sir.
But that's just a projection. Obviously,
Yes,
we
sir.
never know for sure.
Correct.
But that's what we'll budget everything based on.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think that was good. The other question, big picture, was tied to we're taking the lowest number of pennies for the tax rate, the 5 pennies, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Compared to other districts.
Yeah.
Yet, this is probably for the taxpayers out there. They'll still see necessarily or possibly a higher actual tax bill, but it's not necessarily, that's due to bare appraisal, not us trying to take extra pennies or something, because that's the great conversation.
Yes, sir.
We all get the tax bill, and I think it's hard for people and to get understanding is that we're trying to keep it as low as possible at the base rate versus taking extra pennies.
Yes, sir.
But there's still reality, people are going to pay more taxes to the district based on the property value increase realistically.
Yes, sir. And that compressed rate we get from TA, I mean, we're projecting to go down a couple of cents. So we're limited to that 2.5 growth. So, yes, sir. I mean, really, I guess TA kind of sets what your compressed rate's going to be. I mean, we calculated, we have a different company do it, and then TA tells us. So, but yes, sir, it's a reduction.
But we're keeping it the lowest rate. We're not going after
No,
extra
no,
pennies.
no, sir.
No.
No,
That's the conversation.
Right,
No.
the 8 cents, right now, we're at the 5 cents, so VATRE, voter approved tax ratification election wouldn't be needed to try to get those other 3 pennies. But those 3 pennies would correspond to potentially 21 million in extra revenue from the state. So that's what.
There was the cup trade-off and all
Yes,
that.
sir. Yeah, and that's extra. That wouldn't be the state gives this and the tax rate goes down. That's 21 extra dollars because they're enriched pennies.
And last question is, we get 6160 for every student base rate plus some of the special, but how much do we spend on each student? Do we have an average amount that we spent this last year, or is that calculated?
It really would just be taking our total expenditures divided by our enrollment. And so we can easily do that. I don't have it in front of me.
Maybe
but
next time, just so we have an idea of what we're
Yeah,
receiving versus spending, because I know there's some differences in the numbers.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it wouldn't be that much because, I mean, I think this year we're projecting to drop maybe like $5 million to our fund balance, but we use some ESSER dollars to try to balance our budget. So, but yeah, we can bring that to you, sir. And it'd be close to the 6160. It's not like we're dropping a ton of money to our fund balance. So whatever we bring in, we usually goes out.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Madam President. That's all I have.
I have a question. How much money do we receive each year from the federal government, other than on the nutrition program? Do we receive any other funds?
Yes, ma'am, we do receive federal funds, and those are depends if it's Title I monies or Title II. So, yes, we do get federal, but it doesn't hit our general fund, so those are separate little buckets.
And what would you say that is? How much would that be?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I would have to go back and try to, I mean,
There are a lot of different buckets, and we can provide you a summary.
Does that equal that 1.8%?
No.
that 1.8%, that's what we can charge as far as indirect cost So the federal government lets you, since we're doing our payroll in the general fund and we're doing everything on the general fund side, we get to charge those federal funds indirect costs, and that's what that's made up of.
But here's the thing about federal dollars. They're not to be used however we feel like it. They come with strings attached. It is Title I dollars, and here's how you must spend it. Title II, you must spend it this way. Title III, you must spend it this way. So we don't, I guess there's discretion in there, but you have to spend it the way that the federal government tells you to.
And every year when we get audited, that's one of the things that our external auditors have to look at, all of those programs. They do a separate opinion on that. But yes, ma'am, we can bring you the totals because, I mean, we have it in our ACFR, our Annual Financial Comprehensive Report, and it shows all the details. I mean, it goes quite a bit.
Right, but that's why we don't include it in this, because it's not general revenue to be spent the way you all decide to. It's the way the federal government tells us we must.
That's why you don't adopt that budget.
Just had one real quick. This doesn't, this will apply more to the June 6th meeting, and when we're talking about compensation. We've had a couple of requests lately to review our COVID reimbursement for teachers that are and staff that are missing, that we had already ended that, and now we're seeing the numbers starting to come up again. And I didn't know if that could be something that could be discussed when we're talking about the compensation, whether we need to reinstate that or, and of course, we have no idea where the numbers are going to go, but if we're going to need to be looking at that as another piece to making our teachers whole.
I mean, we've seen some rise, but it's, I think as of last week, I just looked today, I think we had 29 staff cases. I think it was 39 the week prior. I think it's 29 this past week. So we're seeing a slight uptick, but, you know, do we need to revisit it? I have not heard that from Ms. Witten yet in HR, and, you know, it hasn't been high like we saw it for a while.
I just had a quick question as well. I think there were, on one of the slides you mentioned that several area districts have more access to revenue. And I saw on the chart that you had here, general fund revenues per ADA and revenues per WADA. So can you explain a little bit what's meant by they have more access to revenue?
So they're getting more dollars per their average daily attendance than we are. And so it could be that they've gone out and gotten more pennies, so they're getting more tier 2 revenue. But it could also be a factor of some of the other buckets, they're getting more money. So they have more students in instructional settings where the weights drive additional funding. When we were talking about tier 1, we talked about the basic allotment, and then we talked about getting more money for students in certain settings, so they could be doing that. They could also be driving, you know, other programs and other things that generate more money here and there. It's not, other than going and getting more pennies, it's not anything that they're necessarily doing to drive access. It's just that their cup is bigger than our cup.
And it's not where they have, I mean, I know it's not where they have more students.
No, it's their student makeup.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just their student
Their
body and the
demographics.
demographics. Yes, ma'am. It's number of special education, the number of GT, the number, I mean, there's all of
All
these
those buckets.
individual buckets that you get. Ms. Crandall, can you back up? Let's back up another slide. Go to where the VATRE you talk about real quick.
The pennies?
Yes, ma'am. So Ms. Williams, this slide right here, and this is to Mr. Hilliard's question. As you can see, there's a bunch of districts here that all have the same number. That's because we've gone out, we have not gone for extra pennies. So 2 districts, as Miss Crandall explained, Alamo Heights and Comal ISD just went out for a VATRE, which they went out to their taxpayers to do it. And what they were able to do is actually increase the number of pennies with no tax increase to the taxpayer. That's what they were able to do. Mm-hmm. So they could go up on that side without any increase whatsoever. You can see there's districts that we've just never been able to do that. But Heights, because I can remember going to Miss Crandall and saying, they're going for a VATR, you have to help me understand this. So that we started looking into it. It's just they qualified for that moment. So did Comal. But when you do that, you have to go to your taxpayers. And again, I know, Miss Huey, you've talked about this. It's kind of like with bonds, right? Even though there's no rate, there's no increase, you have to put on the tax bill. It's like we're going to put in on our announcement later this fall when you all vote and approve our lowered tax rate. You heard me, lower. We're going to lower it, maybe 91 to 91, 4 pennies. In the publication, it's going to say, this is a tax increase, even though it's dropping.
And it's also not where their budgets are, because I know this. It's not where their budgets are larger than ours either, but they've just, as Dr. Micah mentioned, have had, due to their demographics, more accessibility to revenue. Okay.
Hey, Susie, I'm sorry I keep calling you the wrong name. You know what? That's pretty bad, but that's a lady I used to work with a lot.
I know.
I liked her, too. Her name was Susie.
I remember.
This is what happens when I've had a headache all day.
I know, me too.
So
I didn't know if I was going to have to go to the courthouse and change my name or not.
No, but you had fans out there that were texting me going, hey, correct yourself.
So, Dr. Micah, I guess you kind of touched base on it, but those ones, the 4 districts, back in the day, they went from 104 to 117. So that's why they have those 14 cents. Some of them didn't go all the way. And then so during compression, they're still getting those extra pennies. So that's why you see that disparity. But, you know, we are property rich district, I guess. So we get 77% of our revenue. But you might have some other districts that's inverted. They might get 20% from local and 80% from the state. So,
like
you know, I know they try to do equity. And so when we're at 6160 and others are a little bit different, you know, cost of education is cost of education. So it seems like, you know, they try to make it more equitable, and it's not really equitable. So it, you know, when they keep you flat as far as revenue is concerned, it is really difficult to try to do anything other than what you're doing. It's like the status quo, and you know, it's unfortunate. And hopefully, next legislative session, they might address some of those inconsistencies.
Yeah, I remember. I think a couple of years ago, didn't we kind of discuss a VATRE and decided?
Not with me.
Sure, you were there.
If it doesn't cost sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but if it doesn't cost the taxpayer any more dollars out of their pockets, which seems kind of, I don't understand how that could be, why haven't we done a VATRE?
Well, I mean, I guess going out to the voters, we have to go out to the voters, and then we have to try to calculate and make sure with the reduction in the compressed rate, they kind of sent everything kind of crazy. So in the last 2 years with our 3 years now, with our compressed rate, we can, but to try to do a VATRE, like I said, you can get extra revenue. We just don't know if the timing is right to try to do one. I mean, we'd have to go to the taxpayers and say, you're getting your taxes reduced, but values are growing so much that they might not be, they might not take that too well. They might not be receptive to trying to pass, even though we might get an extra 21 million. It's just, you know, trying to sell that to a taxpayer.
And also, would the state take it back anyway?
No, ma'am. No. So that's on top of it. So the 21 million, it's on top of that 6160, like we say, that
It's
revenue.
in that tier 2,
It's the tier 2.
and so it doesn't fit in the cup. It's outside, and so as we were showing 91.33 as that tax rate. If we went out to the voters and they approved it, then it would be 94.33. And so it wouldn't, the 95.25 current tax rate wouldn't reduce as much. And so technically they would still not, they would still save on the tax rate, but it wouldn't be as much as what it would be if we hadn't gone out for the vote.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if we go that route sometime, there's a lot of explanation to it. Again, it's when I saw those two districts go out, I wanted to understand the why. How could they go out and do it, right? I know for many years, it was not talked with me, Miss Williams, but I do know when it was discussed, it was really about swapping pennies, and the state really shunned that because I don't know that it was real transparent. Let's use that word, right? It kind of was shady. But there's just a sweet spot for districts that you can get there where it really does. It doesn't give as much relief to the taxpayer, but it doesn't increase it either. And there's a sweet spot in it where you have to find it to go out there. And again, I can tell you, Comal, Rudy, his wife works out there. You know, that was really pitched from the whole standpoint. That was with their bond. And said this is going to go to teacher pay raises.
Yeah. Their board passed a resolution saying that the additional revenue from those pennies was going to be for teacher raises.
Because you can just go get it and do whatever with it. Most districts that go out for a VATRE are using it for raises because they've hit the cap. Just like Alamo Heights, that was the only way they could generate new revenue is to go do it. And so they found that sweet spot where there wasn't any increase to the
And Ms.
to the
Villarreal,
taxpayer.
so on the debt service, remember there's two rates, there's the M&O and the debt service. So if we do get those 3 pennies, we would try to work our debt service and reduce that, so the net effect would be 0 to the taxpayer. And I think that's what Comal did, and I think that's what Alamo Heights did. That's what they sold, and I think even the city of San Antonio said, hey, pass this bond issue, and it's not going to increase your tax rate, because they were able to fix it out. So like for us, our debt service rate, it's 30 cents. And what we do is, you know, we I guess we'll have a debt service topic in the next, because I can bore you with all the details, but yeah, we try to save as much money from the taxpayers by prepaying a lot of our interest. And we go out a year, we go out 2 years with a low interest rate, and we did commercial paper that we didn't have to pay almost no interest. So I mean, we'll talk about debt service, but that's the way they did it. They raised the M&O side, and then they reduced the debt service side for for no change to the tax rate overall.
Okay, because the taxpayers just can't take any more.
Correct.
Well, and that, what you were suggesting, Ms. Villarreal, was that the debt service, then, some of these instances where we've been able to pay off $42 million and save people money, we would sort of put that in a position where may not be as
Right.
much or any
Right.
at some point.
Yes, sir.
Right. So, Ms. Langer, you were there that night I spoke about this. You know, over the last 10 years, we've saved the taxpayer $185 million, about 18 and a half a year, by prepaying off debt. That's what the INS side has been doing. So we've had that comment, or I've had that question to me, well, why don't you lower it? I can, but then actually as a taxpayer, you're going to pay more over time because I'm not going to pay off debt fast enough. So the analogy I gave was like refinancing from a 30 to a 15 year. Yes, my payment goes up a little bit, but over time I'm going to pay less because I'm paying off debt quicker. That's exactly what we've been doing for a long time now in this district,
Yeah,
paying that debt off.
And our debt service rate's gone down from 40.5 to 30 cents in the last 8 years. I guess we've been able to reduce our debt service and still prepay because we did those type of variable financing on our bonds. So to try to save the taxpayer, like I said, we did commercial paper. So we've been able to reduce that tax rate, but also prepay quite a bit.
So I don't have any more questions. Thank you. We kind of been tag teaming. But the next session will include compensation, correct? Thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else have questions or?
Yeah, I was curious about the, when we talk about the ADA and then the extra learning environments that we can get some do we have an idea of sort of percentage of students in our district that would just get the base 6160 versus our bilingual career tech,
Some
all
kids-
those others?
Some kids fall into multiple buckets, and so we could definitely pull that and calculate it. But it's not as simple as going and backing into, taking your total enrollment and then the number of kids in those programs and backing it off.
Yeah.
Because you'll have some kids who are both economically disadvantaged and special ed, or bilingual and GT. You'll just have kids in multiple buckets, and
Sure.
so, but we definitely have the data to do that.
Okay. I was just curious if there's a, what, to the question Ms. Williams had a minute ago with these other districts, and how that kind of translates to what we have. And I don't know if there's a relatively simple way to do that. I know there's lots of people in different things, so I understand it's not a black and white thing, and it can just do two numbers, but as best we can understand what that means for our students. The other question I had with in the lunch program, the CEP schools, what's the criteria that allows those schools to, I don't think we discussed that.
So.
What gets those schools in that program?
So it's an analysis done, and Ms. Glosson, if I mess this up, bail me out. So we really look at the funding formula for CEP, and so it's whether or not we can do it without having a negative impact to the overall budget. And is she coming to bail me out? I hope so. So I'll let her speak to it.
CEP is not based on free and reduced students. It's actually based on students who are directly certified. And directly certified means they're already on another program that's verified their income. They're on SNAP, they're on TANF, they're on Medicaid. And so those students don't have to apply for free meals. They are directly certified for those. So CEP eligibility is based on that count at every campus. And so in general, a campus has to be more than 40% directly certified to be eligible for CEP.
Okay. I think that probably should have been my more direct question. That probably would have gotten, but yes, I appreciate what you provided.
Much better than what I was saying.
And I know based on our last conversation in March that we have potentially more schools headed that direction. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that and how that factors into our budgeting. I guess my last just general question or just comment, if anybody wants to chime in, but we talk about home values increasing, and we talk about properties freezing and people getting exemptions, and are we in touch with the real estate community on a regular basis to understand what we can be doing in our communities, our different clusters and district to help encourage people to come to Northeast? I know that's a pretty big, broad question, but I know that we've done that in the past where we've tried to stay ahead of those things, but if it truly comes down to enrollment and people moving here and not leaving, that seems to be ground zero for folks knowing where to live and where the good places are and how our schools are and all that wrapped into one thing.
The answer is yes. We do have a good relationship with Sabre. A few years ago, Miss Caldwell and a few other folks actually met over at Madison High School, and we allowed them to use that facility for a meeting, and then they went out on charter buses around the school district. We gave them information, so we've continued that relationship with them for some time. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Byer, 72% of our taxpayers don't have any kids in the system.
Correct.
And I think that was back in March, we showed the graphic where the growth of the market compared to the property values for all the different clusters, it's quite a bit. So trying to move off of that 330,000 right now that the average is going to be pretty difficult to try to attract maybe some of the younger folks.
Yeah, and I know we have a pretty wide-ranging real estate market in our district.
Yes, sir.
Northeast it kind of goes to the extremes. And I know there's other districts that have more affordable housing in some areas. And so I think staying connected to that and understanding how that works with our folks is pretty important.
One more for Dr. Micah. Sorry about this, but you said something that was kind of, just, I guess, a little bit distressing, that the kids have developed this habit now because of COVID of not arriving at school either Monday or Friday or both, or, you know, just deciding to take a vacation. What steps are we taking to stop this and kind of reverse this trend? Are we able to do anything about this?
You know, that's been, so one, we have attendance officers that go out and make home visits and do all sorts of things. We also have a program called ATP. That's an attendance tracking program at our schools that our administrators do and reach out. But ultimately, Ms. Villarreal, if that parent doesn't want that kid to come to school, they're not going to come. They decriminalized attendance years ago. So we used to be able to take students that were delinquent and take them in and go to court, and parents would have to pay fines. Sometimes they actually served jail time because their child wasn't coming. But they decriminalized it. And so the court system was being overwhelmed by the number of kids coming in. I think there was a lot of discussion, and Mr. Jimenez, chime in if I'm off, but I think it was about, you know, that's feeding the school to prison pipeline. You all can't do that. And so they did it. And it's really when we started struggling with attendance quite a bit more, because as a former principal myself, I can remember doing many home visits, and the parent says, well, I can't get them to go. What do you want me to do? And so, you know, we would push out resources. We have family specialists, and we do. But ultimately, the other thing in here as well is that through the pandemic, people lost their jobs. Kids went to work, and some kids are still working. And they're going to go to school for the period of time that they need to. But they're going to keep helping to put food on the table for their family because that's what they need. I mean, these are challenges that not only myself, but superintendents all over the state and the nation are talking about, because it's not unique to us. It's everywhere, this new habit. I was on a phone call either last week or 2 weeks ago with every Bexar County superintendent, even outside of Bexar County. And I said, have any of you seen a return to normal attendance? Not a single one answered yes. They are all well below.
Do we still have that program that kids could work part of the day and then go to school part of the day?
So we do, through our CTE program, students who can go to class, they actually go for a double block course, and then they essentially, it's co-op. And so then they earn credits for high school as well as they can go to work. And we actually get attendance for those.
Is there any way we could sell the parents on that idea if they're having to work to support the family? Is there any way that we could sell the
Yeah.
parent that they could actually do both?
Yes, ma'am. So that's a good question. We actually adjusted. It used to be a time where there was 2 periods off and students didn't have to go to class or get a job. Now, if you want 7th and 8th off, you go through the co-op program and you can essentially get out, I think, 5th period, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And so we've started to communicate that more to our families, but again, it's about what the families feel fits their needs the best.
Okay, thank you.
So, Dr. Micah, essentially there's no more truancy.
Well, we still have it's still our compulsory attendance laws, right? But this brings up, you get down in, so when I was a middle school principal, I had 16-year-olds on my campus at middle school. Now think about that. I don't sell parking permits, right? Because you start retaining and retaining and retaining, and at some point, they become a dropout. So this gets into this vicious cycle of, it's really about intervention and trying to get that child. This is the reason we have family specialists. It's the reason we've used all these other resources to reach out. But, I mean, there's 4 days or parts of a day in a month. You're then considered, you've got a truancy issue. But ultimately, I can send you letters, I can go to your home, but ultimately you still have to come to school. And I can't make Miss Lackhorn send her child to school because she is the parent and she ultimately is going to make that decision.
Anything else? Yes.
Sorry, one more thing. Have we ever asked the parents, other than, well, we can't make him go to school? Have we ever asked the parents why this kid is not wanting to go to school?
Our attendance officer asks that probably 20 times a day. They drive out to the homes. It ranges in a variety of things. Sometimes the kid just isn't going to go to school. They just don't want to go. Sometimes it's because they don't have friends. I mean, I don't know, Mr. Jimenez, you're in charge of the attendance officers. I mean, there's a variety of
It's
of
attendance
reasons.
officers, but it's also the administrators on campus too, that spend a large majority of their time calling parents, going to do home visits like Dr. Micah mentioned. And yeah, the reasons can be just as many as you can think about. But I know many times when we have kids that are coming to school and parents are dropping them off, they won't leave the cars. And so sometimes the administrators have to go try to coax them out of a car. So they're working as best as they can to come up with plans to counsel with the parents, counsel with the kids to get them to come here. But ultimately, if they don't, we don't really have a whole lot of teeth in it. Now, we do have credits, and that's where Dr. Michael was talking about. If a kid isn't there for a certain number of time, they lose credit. High schools lose credit. But again, that's where it starts that vicious cycle that we're talking about being there longer and longer, being retained, and so on and so forth. So, but it's not from a lack of trying from our administrators. They really are working hard on that.
Are these kids being bullied in school, and maybe this is why they don't want to come to school?
Miss Villarreal, this is probably, some of them are, they're being bullied at home and beaten. I mean, it is a variety of reasons why our students don't come to school. I don't know that there's a common theme across it, other than this is why it's so important that we're making those individual contacts one by one, because each is an individual case in of itself. And so we have to go out, and we do, and we speak to them, we encourage them, we try to build in different attendance plans, we try to accommodate them, but ultimately, sometimes they're just, it's a variety of things. They could have been abused, they could have been sexually abused, they could have been, this is their sixth school this school year because they've moved all over the place. It is just a ton of reasons on what's going on, or they're in a divorced family and they're going through it. Now dad has them and now mom has them, and there's just a lot of reasons. I wish there was one. If you knew that one magical reason, I promise you you're a billionaire tomorrow, because schools have been struggling with this since I began in 1995. It's a little bit more. I think part of it today is we've made it easy. The parent no longer has to come to the school for the work. They can get it online. Well, that's very convenient for a parent, and it's convenient for a child, because the one thing is, I don't want them home with the flu and missing out, because now we have it. But on the flip side, the take is, that may be encouraging some of that behavior. So I don't know where the sweet spot is in it, because I certainly don't want to put more on parents when they don't have to come to the school. Look, I can get it, but I also don't want you taking off and spending more and more time away with your kid. Plus, through the pandemic, parents learned a lot about the compulsory attendance law. They know that they can miss up to 17 days with no loss of credit.
Thank you. No more questions for me.
Okay. Anything else?
So, I'm just going to end with this, because I appreciate all the questions y'all are asking about budget, and I'll leave you with this reminder. The state is wonderful about making something extremely complex seem very simplistic, and I'll give you two examples. One is accountability. We give a letter grade to a campus or a district A to F. What people don't know and don't, I think, often realize is for a district like us to receive a letter grade, I believe it's like 120-something different data points that goes into that letter grade. It looks so simplistic because on your tax bill it says any ISD, and you think there, except it's tons and tons of complexity in behind it that it just seems so simplistic, but it's just not. So just kind of always keep that in the back of your mind. It's what I do as we're looking at all of these different buckets and different pieces, is it seems simple until you really get in. It's extremely complex. Thank you.
You're welcome. Susie, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all.
It was, yeah. You kept saying that. I was like, I don't think that's her name. But I couldn't kick you. All right, but thank you very much for the presentation. And at that, we will have item 7, adjournment, and the time is 7:22. Y'all have a good night.